fans minstrels ever had. I went to the Public Records Office to riffle through some 600-year-old documents in search of evidence of Edward's minstrel craze. Here, for example, is the treasury roll for his coronation, so it's a list of expenses for the coronation. And it lists here all the minstrels at the coronations, 154 of them. You can see there's 5 trumpeters of the boy prince, Thomas the harpist, William the harper, Henry the flautist, Tannin the organist, and here we've got little William, organist of the Countess of Hereford. Sounds all very lavish, but conventional. But then the coronation was a state occasion. In private, however, it seems that Edward enjoyed something a little more spicy. This is the wardrobe account in which all the king's personal expenditure was kept. Here we can see on the anniversary of the death of Piers Gaveston, his intimate friend and perhaps lover, he employed a certain Bernard the Fool and his 54 naked dancers. While the English nobility were still getting their kicks out of stories about who killed who and how far their brains were spread around in the process, down in the south of France, a new kind of song was evolving. It was subtle, sophisticated, and sexy. The pioneer of this new style of poetry was not a professional musician. He was an aristocrat, the gloriously randy Duke William IX of Aquitaine, and his palace was here in Poitiers. If not the most rampant of French noblemen, Duke William was certainly the most upfront about it. He talked of opening an abbey for prostitutes near his castle, and confessed that he pursued women with but one objective in mind. I'll end up with my hand up a cloak. He was the first of a new breed of court entertainer, aristocratic and educated, the troubadours. And by the 12th century, the court here at Poitiers was the most important cultural centre in France. It was here that Duke William changed forever the story of the minstrel. He invented a new kind of poetry that raved about his favourite subjects, love and sex. His style was irreverent, witty, and made fun of everything, including himself. I made these verses just for fun, not for myself, nor anyone, nor of great deeds that knights have done, nor of lovers true. I made them riding in the sun, and my horse, here too. The troubadours revolutionised the way people thought about the sexes. They accorded women superiority over men, and they made love a suitable subject for fiction. Up to this time, it had been punishable by death to address a love song to a married woman. It was regarded as the equivalent of casting a spell on her. But the most revolutionary thing about the troubadours was that they did all this in the everyday language of the man in the street. And it just so happened that the troubadours lived in the region of France where instead of oui for yes, they said oc. It was known as the land of the oc, the Pays d'Oc, and the language spoken was Occitan. The French rap artists, les fabulous troubadours, inspired by these medieval poets, are spearheading a revival in Occitan poetry. So, what was so important about the fact they were doing this in Occitan?
For the troubadours, all the literature is in Latin, understood only by the aristocratic people. But when they sing and when they write in Occitan, everybody can understand. They make poetry in a common language of the people.
The language people speak in the street?
Yes.
The troubadours used the language of the man in the street for dazzlingly sophisticated intellectual games, like this verbal jousting match in which the two poets try to outwit each other with their rhymes and verbal dexterity.
The sophistication of the writing is very important. Yeah. And the sophistication of the music also is very important for this period.
And did this poetry have an influence on Europe?
This poetry has a big impact in Europe because it's the first time they sing make love not war, make music not war, make tournament of poetry not war. In Middle Age, Occitan is a sign of sophistication. Merci beaucoup. Merci vraiment beaucoup.
The sophisticated culture of the troubadours and the fashion for writing and composing poetry in the native language spread across the courts of Europe. The whole nature of court entertainment was revolutionized. Kings and princes now saw that their realm was no longer defined by simple geographical boundaries, but that they also ruled over an intellectual territory, the territory of literature and song. And a new breed of court poet began to replace the old rough-and-ready minstrels. The new court poets were decidedly sniffy about the old minstrels. In France, for example, Eustace Deschamps said, "The artificial music of the minstrels could be learned by le plus rude homme du monde, by the most uncouth man in the world." In a way, the situation was a bit like the mid-20th century, when the music hall comedians, with their repertoire of hand-me-down material, found themselves displaced by the university-educated satirists of the television age, coming up with something fresh every week. The English court finally caught up with the rest of Europe during the reign of Richard II. And the star of Richard's court was the greatest of medieval English poets, Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer helped to put Richard's court on a par with the great sophisticated courts of France and Italy. In one of his poems, he describes how a goddess commands him to finish his book and then give it to Richard's Queen Anne. "Go now thy way, and when this book is made, give it the Queen, on my behalf, at Eltham or at Sheen." Eltham was one of the King and Queen's favourite palaces, and Chaucer actually supervised the rebuilding of it in the 1390s to make it a fit venue for Richard's fashion-conscious court. Ironically, it has itself become a victim of fashion, having had an Art Deco makeover at the start of the last century. Only one room gives any idea of its medieval past. The Great Hall here at Eltham dates from the 1470s. Richard II's hall would have been smaller. But nonetheless, it must have been here, on this very spot, that Geoffrey Chaucer would have read out for the first time many of his famous poems to the king and his court, just as he is in this 15th century painting. To be present when poets like this read out from their latest work must have been a hugely exciting experience, a sort of medieval equivalent of attending a movie premiere. The old-style minstrels began to find they were no longer fashionable. They had to go down market. They did indeed become wandering minstrels, traipsing around the land in search of an audience.
Adultery is wrong, fornication is wrong.
Eking out a living in fairs and at street corners, wherever they could find a crowd. The upside was that they no longer had to fill the role of propagandists for rich patrons. In fact, quite the reverse. The unemployed minstrels could easily turn into sort of medieval Billy Braggs, sort of popular political agitators.
I heard men on earth make much lamentation, how they are injured in their work.
Do you remember that hit song from 1315 with that catchy title, The Evils of Taxation? You know, it was written after the Great Famine. And the writer complains that he's being taxed 10 times over, so he has to sell his seed corn, and he's going to end up a beggar.
I can no longer live with my gleaning, yet there is more grievous cut to the bone. For every fourth penny must go to the king. Good years and corn are both gone. No one cares to listen to stories or sing songs.
Well, I suppose when money's tight, no one's going to waste it on minstrels. The power of minstrels to spread dissent was something that couldn't be ignored. In Wales, for example, during the rebellion of Owen Glendower, minstrels were banned throughout the Principality. But even for the court poets, life could be precarious, as Chaucer may have found out to his cost. Richard's court seems to have encouraged a relaxed, easygoing intellectual atmosphere in which satire and lampoon were allowed to flourish. Chaucer took advantage of this to satirise the way the church had become commercialised in the 14th century. And it could be quite vicious satire. Try this for size. An angel takes a friar down to hell. And the friar looks around and says, "Oh, I can't see any friars around here. Does that mean we all go to heaven?" And the angel says, "Afraid not. There are plenty of friars around here." And he takes the friar to Satan and accosts Satan. "Hold up thy tail, thou Satanas," said he. "Show forth thine arse, and let the friar see where is the nest of friars in this place." And ere that half a furlong way of space, right so as bees come swarming from a hive, out of the devil's arse began to drive 20,000 friars in a rout, and throughout hell they swarmed all about, and came again as fast as they may gone, and in his arse they crept in every John. Chaucer may have felt safe writing this outrageous satire of the church in Richard II's court in the 1390s. But within a few years, that court was to be violently overthrown and Richard murdered. The whole political scene changed dramatically, and Chaucer was caught right in the middle of it. Richard was ousted by his cousin Henry IV, who colluded with the exiled Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Arundel, to seize the throne. A religious crackdown ensued, with Arundel threatening to burn those who criticised the church, especially those who did so in plain English that any Tom, Dick or Harriet could understand. Chaucer must have felt he'd been caught with his pants down. Suddenly his carefree vernacular satire was political anathema. And this is where we come to one of the great unnoticed mysteries of history. Chaucer, the father of English literature, disappears without trace around the time that Archbishop Arundel is trying to limit the use of English in literature. Chaucer, of course, was one of the most famous men in the kingdom, and yet there's no record of his death. He doesn't leave a will. We don't even know when he died. All we have to go on is this now illegible inscription on this tomb that was put up over a century and a half after he disappeared. And that, as far as we know, never even contained his body. Isn't it odd that such an important man should have disappeared so completely? Could it be that he was deliberately disappeared? Of course, he could have just fallen off a ladder. We don't know. But the happy-go-lucky medieval entertainers of our imaginations don't seem to have been so happy-go-lucky after all. Literature had come a long way from the days of Taillefer to Chaucer. But one thing hadn't changed. Whether you were a minstrel of the 11th century or a sophisticated court poet of the 14th, it could be a dangerous business.